4 penalties, 3 race weekends, one of the greatest drivers to ever sit in a Formula One car, a 7-time world champion, a man with more wins than almost anyone in the sport's history, and suddenly, in the summer of 2026, Lewis Hamilton looks like a rookie who can't stop making mistakes. Except, he isn't making mistakes. Not the kind you think. Because when you actually pull apart what happened at Monaco, at Silverstone, at Spa, and then at the Hungarian Grand Prix, a very different picture starts to form. One where the margins are so microscopic, so absurdly thin, that even Formula One insiders are starting to ask the question nobody wants to say out loud: is the FIA actually targeting Lewis Hamilton? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to see the pattern for yourself, and you're going to understand exactly why Hamilton's own team boss stood in front of the cameras and said the quiet part out loud. Let's set the scene. It's the summer break of 2026. Hamilton is fighting for his 8th world championship, the one title that would cement him as untouchable, the one number that would finally settle every debate about the greatest of all time. He's sitting just over 30 points behind championship leader Kimi Antonelli, a gap that is absolutely closable, a gap that a driver of Hamilton's caliber has erased before in a matter of race weekends. This is supposed to be the story of a legend clawing his way back to the top. Instead, it's turning into something else entirely, a story about stewards, about telemetry readouts, about fractions of a kilometer per hour, and about a driver who is starting to sound less like a competitor and more like a man who feels cornered. Here's where it starts. The Hungarian Grand Prix. Qualifying. Hamilton is flying. He's just put together a lap good enough for second on the grid, right behind Lando Norris, who's chasing his first pole of the season. It should be a good day. But in the closing moments of Q3, Oscar Piastri comes through turn 1 on a flying lap and finds Hamilton's Ferrari crawling on the racing line. Piastri's lap is compromised. He ends up 5th, nearly half a second off his own teammate. And just like that, the stewards summon car 44. Hamilton's explanation is almost painfully simple. He'd just finished his own fast lap, and the radio call warning him that Piastri was closing in came through too late for him to react. A miscommunication, a timing issue, the kind of racing incident that happens dozens of times a season and usually gets waved off with a warning. Not this time. The stewards dropped the hammer, a 3-place grid penalty. Hamilton, who qualified second, is now starting 5th for Sunday's race, on a circuit at the Hungaroring, where everybody in the paddock knows overtaking is brutally difficult. It's not a minor punishment, it's a race-defining one. But here's the part that should make your jaw drop. That wasn't even the only penalty Hamilton picked up that weekend, because just a few hours later, during the actual Grand Prix, under a late virtual safety car period, Hamilton pits for tires, and the stewards come knocking again. This time the charge is speeding in the pit lane. Now, when you hear speeding, you probably imagine something reckless, something dangerous, maybe a car blasting through at twice the limit. Here's the number that the FIA's own official documentation confirmed. Hamilton was clocked at exactly 80.1 kilometers per hour. The limit at the Hungaroring pit lane is 80 kilometers per hour flat. That's it. That's the offense. 1/10 of a kilometer per hour over the line. To put that in perspective, that's a margin so small it barely registers as a rounding error. Ferrari's own team principal later revealed that the actual telemetry showed Hamilton doing something like 80.06 kilometers per hour, against an agreed tolerance of around 80.05, meaning the real overshoot was a number so tiny it's almost comedic. And under FIA regulations, there is zero room for discretion here. Any breach, no matter how microscopic, triggers an automatic 5-second penalty. No warning, no wiggle room, just a stopwatch and a rulebook that doesn't care how close you came to being compliant. And if this was a one-off, you could write it off as bad luck, a driver having a rough weekend, nothing more. But it isn't a one-off. This is where the story stops being about one bad Sunday and starts becoming something that F1 fans everywhere are calling a pattern, because rewind to Monaco earlier this season, and you'll find Hamilton picking up a 5-second penalty for exactly the same offense, speeding in the pit lane by exactly 0.1 kilometers per hour. Not similar, not roughly the same. The identical razor-thin margin, on a different continent, weeks apart. What are the odds of that happening twice to the same driver on the exact same fraction of a decimal point? And it doesn't stop there. Rewind further to Silverstone, the British Grand Prix, and Hamilton was one of 5 different drivers penalized in the same session for going just 0.1 kilometers per hour over a limit. A decision that sparked weeks of debate across the paddock about whether the FIA's tolerance levels had become so unforgivingly strict that they were punishing drivers for physics, not for actual dangerous driving. Then there's Spa-Francorchamps, the Belgian Grand Prix, where Hamilton tagged George Russell's Mercedes into a race-ending spin on the opening lap at Les Combes, picked up a 5-second penalty for that contact, and then, almost as an afterthought, was involved in an incident where his own Ferrari mechanic was struck during a chaotic pit release. An episode the stewards controversially chose to only fine the team for, leaving fans and pundits stunned that no further sporting sanction was applied to Hamilton despite the danger involved. 4 race weekends, 4 separate penalty situations, and through every single one of them, a common thread: decisions that hover right on the edge of the rulebook, decisions that could have gone either way, decisions that, every single time, seem to land against the 7-time champion. Now here's where Hamilton himself enters the story, and this is the moment the clip that's been ripping through social media actually comes from. After crossing the finish line at the Hungarian Grand Prix, still processing the second penalty of the day, Hamilton got on the radio to his Ferrari pit wall and let his frustration boil over, telling his team that every single opportunity the stewards get, they use it against him. It's raw, it's real. It's a 7-time world champion, a man who has seen every kind of controversy this sport can produce, sounding genuinely exhausted by what he's facing. And it didn't stop at the radio message. Speaking to media over that same weekend, Hamilton admitted he was trying to stay positive, but conceded that holding on to that positivity was getting harder and harder with penalty after penalty piling up. He even pointed out something that should stop you in your tracks. In one of his earlier penalties this season, the very driver he was penalized for colliding with publicly called it a racing incident, nothing more, and yet the stewards still hit Hamilton with a sanction anyway. Think about that for a second. The person on the receiving end of the contact, the person who arguably had every reason to want Hamilton punished, said it wasn't even worth a penalty, and the FIA disagreed and handed one down regardless. So now the question everyone in the paddock is whispering: is this really just bad luck? Is this simply the price of being aggressive, of pushing every boundary the way a championship contender has to? Or is something else going on here? Let's actually steelman the other side for a second, because a fair story has to. The FIA's rules on pit lane speeding are automatic by design, specifically so there's no room for favoritism. The same 0.1 km/h breach that caught Hamilton also caught 4 other drivers in the same Silverstone session, which suggests this isn't a Hamilton problem, it's a tolerance calibration problem affecting the entire grid. Ferrari's own principal admitted the tolerance the FIA now allows has been tightened compared to a few years ago, when cars used to get almost a full km/h of leeway before triggering a penalty. That's not a conspiracy against one driver. That's the sport getting stricter across the board, and Hamilton just happens to be the one currently in the headlines fighting for a championship, which means every one of his penalties gets 10 times the scrutiny that the exact same penalty would get if it happened to a midfield driver nobody's watching. And on the impeding call with Piastri, the stewards reviewed telemetry, video, and radio communication from both cars before making their decision. This wasn't a snap judgment, it was a formal investigation, with both drivers and both team representatives present. But here's why that explanation doesn't fully satisfy the fans who are furious right now. Because even if every single individual penalty is technically justifiable on its own, technically defensible under the letter of the rulebook, there's a difference between a rule being fair in isolation and a rule being applied in a way that consistently, weekend after weekend, costs one specific driver championship points at the exact moment he's trying to close a title gap. 4 penalties in 3 weekends isn't just statistically unusual. It's the kind of frequency that, fair or not, starts to feel personal to the man living through it. And when you're 41 years old, chasing history, chasing an 8th title that would put you in a stratosphere no other driver has ever reached, every single point matters in a way it simply didn't earlier in your career. That's why Hamilton's frustration isn't just emotional noise. It's a driver watching the mathematics of his championship dream get chipped away by decisions measured in tenths of a kilometer per hour, decisions he has almost no ability to control, no matter how clean he tries to drive. So where does this actually leave the championship fight? Hamilton heads into the summer break sitting roughly 50 points back after Hungary, a gap that's grown specifically because of the penalties we just walked through. Penalties that, without them, could have had him significantly closer to Antonelli heading into the second half of the season. That's the brutal reality of Formula One's points system. It doesn't care about intent, it doesn't care about margins of 0.1 kilometers per hour, it doesn't care about a mechanic who wasn't fully out of the way, it only cares about where you finish, and every place lost to a penalty is a place that could decide a championship in November. And that's exactly why this story isn't going away. Every remaining race weekend this season is now a pressure test. Will Hamilton get a clean run, free of the kind of razor-thin, could-go-either-way calls that have defined his last month? Or does the pattern continue, and does the sport have to reckon with a much bigger conversation about whether its tolerance levels and steward consistency are actually fit for purpose at the highest level of motorsport? Here's what I want you to walk away with. This isn't about picking a side and screaming conspiracy without evidence. That's lazy, and it insults your intelligence. But it's also not about pretending nothing unusual is happening, because 4 penalties in 3 weekends, at margins this microscopic, is not normal, even by Formula One's exacting standards. Somewhere between the FIA is out to get Hamilton and this is all just coincidence lies the uncomfortable truth. A legendary driver, fighting for one of the greatest achievements of his career, is running out of margin for error in a sport that now offers him none. And whether you think the stewards are being fair or being brutally harsh, one thing is undeniable: Lewis Hamilton's 8th title just got a whole lot harder, and the man himself is telling you, in his own words, exactly how that feels. If this breakdown opened your eyes to what's really happening behind the scenes of Hamilton's 2026 season, smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more fans who need to see this story. Drop a comment below and tell me straight. Do you think the FIA is being unfair to Hamilton, or is this just the cost of chasing history at 41 years old? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next race weekend could make or break this entire championship battle, and you do not want to miss how this story unfolds. Share this with a fellow F1 fan who's been arguing about this exact controversy. Let's settle the debate in the comments. See you in the next one.